live, blindness, all sorts of horrific things that you can imagine sort of slowly happening to someone. And what happened is these stories were reimagined and then put into practice on his love. His famous poem, The Raven, is about his descent into madness, so that's paralleled in, what happens to Poe's character. But I think there's a sort of plethora of short stories that the writers have taken elements from to create what happens in the film. John was great as Poe, really wonderful, and he brought a lot of lyricism to the language as well, which would have been typical, I think, of a poet, to have a melody to his language and a flair, and he brought that, and he really inhabited that kind of neurotic, alcoholic man, The stance of the period, and it's very it's a lot more structured than our clothes, and a lot more structured in speech and in manner. And then we learnt to waltz, John and I, the Viennese waltz. So there's been a lot of stuff I've learned.
I'm not sure that he's an absolute aristocrat. I think he's a person who has come from industrial enterprise and would have had a certain amount of background, but is ultimately a man who gets his hands dirty when necessary, but hasn't needed to for a while. So I suppose in a way his daughter in a way is his lineage and is obviously the apple of his eye and all the rest of it, but he's not used to being powerless in this situation. At the outset he thinks Poe is self-indulgent and incapable of love, apart from everything else. But I mean, Poe was quite a successful man at the time. There was an audience with the president, and so I think ultimately the threat of Poe is, for Hamilton, is that he's going to take his daughter and bring her into dark and evil places. The essential thing about this story, I think, is that it's not just an action thriller or whatever. And he would have been obviously a reason to think very seriously about doing this and want to do it and get involved. And immediately it was clear that he was going into a more profound place. I think what we've managed to do is to create a world. And at times some of the churches and some of the buildings were extraordinary, because you could kind of feel that we were actually not only in a different geographical position, but also in a different place and time. And so, I think it's worked extraordinarily well. And particularly we're in the depths of winter. I think the light, everything has kind of, it all made that world very, very easy to imagine. Luke is an absolute gem, he really is. And it's been like that with the cast. We've had, and it's been purely about the work, and then just really congenial and fun outside of all that. No, I've had a ball. It was one of those ones that got better the longer you stay exploring it. It became, interesting uncovering the stuff that we found.
Looking for scripts, doing films, the things that you choose, it's a bit like sort of panning for gold, and you don't often come across scripts that really resonate with you. And I think that this film did. The script was really great, and I thought it was really tight, when I got it. And I just thought it was a great, interesting concept that you could ultimately have a character, being Edgar Allan Poe, who's ultimately becomes a character in one of his own stories, which I thought was a pretty cool concept. What I tried to do was make it like a Poe story, you know, like I think the Poe stories have this great kind of macabre quality, you know, in the aesthetic, and you always felt like it was, you know, the Poe stories happened in this sort of netherworld, you know, like of his imagination. From when I first met John, you know, he kind of really got what the script was and what the character could be, and I think he really wanted to go to a place that really suited like the Poe character. And I remember we had a discussion earlier on where I said to him, well, you know, I think there's like a darkness in you that hasn't been exploited on film yet, you know, like from a character perspective, I guess. And I think that he said, you know, maybe he thought that was a challenge or something, I guess. John really got into sort of, you know, he started to train a bit, he started to slim down some, you know, so he became sort of more Poe-like. And we didn't want to get into that sort of classic kind of caricature of Poe, you know, with the moustache and the crazy hair, because I think that, you know, it's been parodied from everything from, you know, Mad Magazine to probably like The Simpsons to, well, definitely The Simpsons. And so I think we came up with a good, interesting look, which is, you know, like with his hair and his goatee and that. And I think, you know, we weren't afraid to make him sort of look gaunt and sort of look like what our version, you know, like in our mind's eye, what Poe should look like. In our story, he is that guy and he is writing these stories, but ultimately he's never been responsible for anything he writes. You know, he writes all these macabre stories with death and killing, but also, you know, being the precursor of detective fiction, you know, like he was all these different things. And in our story, he becomes in some way responsible for what he writes, and he's never been made responsible. And I think when he butts up against Fields, Fields says, well, look, you know, surely you can't write all these things and take no responsibility for it. And Poe's initial reaction is, well, why? You know, is imagination a crime? You know, like that's the place that he comes from, until Emily is taken and then sort of the chickens come home to roost.